Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lisa Sturtevant, and I am Chief Economist here with Bright MLS. And I'm really glad that you all could join us today for this update on the Washington area housing market, taking a look at the October home sales activity numbers and take a look ahead at what we might expect for the rest of the year and then into 2023. It is a very interesting housing market. There's a lot of change going on, and I really appreciate the chance to join you all today to talk a little bit about what I'm seeing in the data. We are recording this webinar, so you can listen to it later or share it with a colleague or a client. And there's also an opportunity to ask questions. You can use the Q&A function here in the Zoom platform. Feel free to offer up any comments or questions you have throughout. I'll try and keep an eye on it. And I always am eager to hear what you all are seeing on the ground and to see what questions you have, because I want to make sure that that we're tracking the information that's most important for you and for your business. So let's get started and see where the market has gone. I sort of start out the same way each month. And the first is to take a look at the number of closed sales in October compared to the same month a year ago. You can see home sales were down significantly in the Washington area, down about 36% compared to a year ago. You can see when you look at the map on the right that home sales are really down pretty dramatically from a year ago across the Washington region. Now, last year was a very busy year. I've said this before, but you can see from the chart that home sales have been down year over year really for many months. And for a while, the slowdown in closed sales was due to the fact that, frankly, there was just such low inventory. But as mortgage rates topped 7% in October, we saw the impact of those rates really hit the market in a way that we sort of hadn't seen for a while. In fact, the Washington area market had been a little bit more resilient than some of the other markets in the Mid-Atlantic. But in October, there was just this pretty dramatic downturn in sales activity. Despite the slowdown in sales, we are still seeing price growth. But as you'll notice here, the pace of price appreciation in the Washington area has slowed considerably. Instead of double-digit year-over-year price gains in October, the median sales price was up 2.8% compared to a year ago. And that is a little bit below the long-term average annual price appreciation in the Washington region, really setting us back to more typical price growth. But there are some markets across the Washington area where prices are still rising pretty briskly. For example, in Frederick County, Maryland, the median price was up 10%, nearly 10% compared to where it was a year ago. In Loudoun County, prices are still rising pretty fast, 7.5% price growth in October compared to last year. There are some places where we're starting to see year over year prices lower. So, for example, you can see in Arlington County, in DC, even in Montgomery County, down a little bit compared to last year. Now, some of that is a function of just the mix of sales in the market this year compared to a year ago. So we're not seeing any like wholesale declines year over year in home prices, though we are starting to see certainly home prices falling from their peak. And the peak really was earlier this summer. So I expect that we're going to continue to see slower price growth. We will start to see some other places show year-over-year declines in home prices. And I'll come back to this when we do the outlook. But even if we do see some pulling back from where prices have been over the last year, we're still going to find that home values are still significantly above where they were prior to the pandemic in 2019. One of the reasons why home prices continue to rise, as I've said before, is that inventory is still pretty low. In October, we did see the number of active listings up 3.9% metro-wide compared to where they were last year at this time. But if you look at the map, you can see these inventory rises are really happening very differently across the Washington area. In Loudoun County, during the pandemic, during 2020, 2021, we saw inventory drawn down very, very quickly. Now we're starting to see inventory build up, not because of a lot of new listings coming onto the market, but because of that slowdown in buyer activity. So in Loudoun County, we saw that inventory was up 50% compared to where it was a year ago. Prince George's County, inventory up 40% compared to a year ago. But there are some places where we're still seeing inventory fall year over year: Montgomery County, Arlington County, Alexandria. And part of that is because while the higher mortgage rates and the economic uncertainty have caused buyers to pull back, it's also having the effect of causing sellers to pull back. So we're seeing significant declines in the number of new listings coming onto the market as sellers are taking a wait and see approach. As you know, most sellers are buyers as well. And so as they're thinking about listing their home, they're wondering, sort of what mortgage they're going to have to take on, where they might find a place to move. And so that, coupled with the fact that new listing activity slows down anyway in November and December because of the holidays, means that in some places we're seeing inventory continue to decline. There was a question about the slides, and we do post the slides in the webinar each month. If you don't see them, please do reach out to me directly. I will make sure that you have the link to find them. I know how frustrating that can be when you're looking for something. So there's another question about the fact that it's interesting that Loudoun and Frederick have increased prices and inventories, and that sellers see an advantage. I think that's right. I think that there is there is more inventory on the market in Frederick and Loudoun County. I think that while buyers do have more leverage than they did a year ago, certainly it is still a seller's market. And while there be some negotiation on price, maybe that we haven't seen over the last couple of years, and there'll be buyers who are able to ask for concessions like home inspections and appraisals, then it is still a very tight inventory, even with this inventory growth. So we are still seeing prices rise in many local markets across the region. We're seeing this in many markets across the Mid-Atlantic, and it really has become very clear that there's a lot of difference across the local markets. And you'll probably even see it from subdivision to subdivision or from neighborhood to neighborhood. The key driver is going to be, how much inventory is there available on the ground, and how eager are sellers to sell. Last month, I presented some data on sellers dropping their prices. And the key there was when you see sellers pricing their homes appropriately for this market, as opposed to the market from 6 months ago or a year ago, homes are still moving pretty quickly because the inventory is so low. So even though we do have low inventory, the story really has been the effect that higher mortgage rates, higher home prices, general sort of economic malaise, those effects have been showing up in terms of the number of new contracts or pending sales, down 41% compared to where we were a year ago. And while that's sort of dramatic in and of itself, that year-over-year decline, it's an even bigger decline than we saw back in April of 2020, when the pandemic shut down the economy, shut down the housing market, and transactions ground to a halt. So we're seeing a very quick about face in the Washington area market here, as mortgage rates are really taking their toll on buyers' purchasing power and having people kind of sit on the sidelines. We got news this morning, and I'll touch on this more in just a minute, that mortgage rates are falling. And there may be some better news on the horizon for buyers who have been sort of taking that wait and see approach to see if rates are going to fall, that they may find that the mortgage rate environment is a little bit better. So there's a question about tracking expired, canceled, and withdrawn listings. And that's a great question. We haven't been doing as great a job as we should be about tracking those sort of status changes. And so beginning in January, we'll be adding those kinds of data points to our weekly reports that come on Tuesday mornings. We'll be able to know the number of listings that had a contract that were canceled, and we'll also be tracking sellers who have withdrawn their listings. I don't know if we're going to track expired listings or not, but that's a good suggestion to kind of make sure that we're tracking that kind of movement in the market. And those are the kinds of questions I really appreciate, because we want to make sure that we're getting you the information that is most helpful. And I do think those types of patterns in how listings are moving in and out of the market for various reasons will actually help us to understand where the market might be headed. We do know that homes are staying on the market longer. We've been talking about this for the last few months. This is the median days on market in the Washington metropolitan area overall, it hit 15 in October. Across the region, you can see median days on market sort of varies, a week in Falls Church, 19 days in Arlington, still lower than where we were prior to the pandemic, but it does mean that homes are staying on the market longer. Buyers are able to take a little bit more time. Like I said, sellers who are sort of stretching on price are finding that their homes are staying on the market much longer. And I think that's kind of the trend that we're going to see here over the winter. It's such an interesting market, right? Because it's not that so during the Great Recession, we saw this really dramatic pulling back of buyers, while we saw kind of a surge of supply because of foreclosures and new construction. We have a very different situation in this market where both sides of the housing market equation are contracting. So we have fewer buyers, fewer sellers. So we have a smaller overall market, but those buyers who are still in the market are still finding it pretty competitive. And as I mentioned before, it still remains a market where sellers are generally kind of in charge of the transaction, as long as they're paying attention to market conditions on the ground now, as opposed to where they might have been 6 months ago or a year ago. I've said this before, and I think it is more important than ever, right, that buyers and sellers are working with a realtor who understands the very local market, because there's a lot of news out there about what's going on nationally. But really, whatever's going on nationally has very little bearing on your decision to purchase a home in a particular neighborhood or a particular jurisdiction. So having that local information, I think, is more important than ever. So as we look ahead, I think there's a lot of things that are on people's minds, a lot of things that are getting a lot of media attention, a lot of things that are sort of national in nature. And one is this idea of how the Federal Reserve continues its effort to tamp down inflation. And we did get some good news in October, or we got some good news in November about inflation in October. Inflation had been sitting above 8% in September, and in October, inflation fell to 7.7%. So that means that prices of lots of goods and services that people buy are 7.7% higher than they were last year. That doesn't necessarily sound like good news, but it does demonstrate that inflation is coming down, and that has made people begin to think that maybe the actions of the Federal Reserve, those rate hikes that the Federal Reserve has been putting into place now 6 times during 2022, that maybe those interventions are having the intended effect of bringing down consumer and business demand, which can then bring down inflation. And I would wait and see what next month's inflation reading is before we sort of declare the battle against high inflation over. But there's a lot of feeling now that that one data point is enough for the Fed to begin thinking about being less aggressive on those rate hikes. And that could have implications for mortgage rates and for mortgage rates coming down. This is the red line is mortgage rates. We hit over 7% during October and early November. This morning, we got the data from Freddie Mac. The average on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage rate fell to 6.61%, about a half percentage point drop in 1 week. And that is solely being explained by that better than expected inflation report, which made investors, the markets believe that the Federal Reserve is not going to be amping up those rate hikes in December and January at the same pace. But you can see they have been increasing the federal funds rate, which is that light blue line on the chart, and that has sort of been an indicator of higher mortgage rates. There's also the yield on the 10-year Treasury, which is that dark blue line. I think I mentioned this each time we get together. That is wider than it typically is, and so we will watch that rate, that yield on the 10-year Treasury. As that comes down, we can also expect that mortgage rates will come down. But look, I think that we may have hit peak mortgage rates, or we may not have. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of volatility in mortgage rates through the end of the year. I think there's going to be a lot of buyers who are trying to time rates. And I think That's really difficult. We saw rates dip last week, but in our weekly data, we didn't see a big surge of new contracts. There's just a lot of other things going on in the market. And I think instead of timing rates, the advice seems to be that making sure buyers are shopping rates, are getting quotes from different lenders, and are, making sure that they're getting the best loan they can with the best terms and rate that fits their needs, because trying to time where the rates are going is probably a fool's errand. We do know that higher mortgage rates have eroded buyers' purchasing power. I've shown a similar chart to this, but it really drives the point home and is helpful actually with talking with sellers that, buyers are shopping a monthly payment. They're not shopping necessarily, they're not actually shopping the home price. Home prices in the Washington area are up about 3% year over year, but that typical monthly payment is up more than 60%. So the other way to think about it is you can see the monthly payment has increased by more than $1,300 over the last year. If rates hadn't more than doubled, then we would have seen that monthly payment increase by only about $100. And so this makes it a much more challenging environment for buyers. More so for first-time buyers than for repeat buyers, right? First-time buyers who may have been, really working to save for a down payment are finding that, they have to readjust their price expectations about the type of home they can be looking at or what neighborhoods they may be looking at. And many have decided to just kind of step out of the market altogether. The National Association of Realtors released their 2022 profile of home buyers and sellers recently, and the share of purchasers to the share of home sales that were to first-time buyers reached the lowest level in 41 years. So 26% of home sales nationally were to first-time home buyers. Typically that share is between 30 and 40%. And that's just testament to the fact that it is in this high interest rate and still high price environment, it's really challenging for first-time buyers to get into the market. So I know a lot of you are asking, well, are prices going to fall? Is it going to make it easier for buyers? And I think there is a lot of reason to believe that we'll see prices fall from the peaks of where they were. We've actually already started to see that in some local markets. But even if prices did fall pretty dramatically, we'll still see that home values are significantly above where they were, 3 years ago. So if you're talking with someone you worked with and they're worried they bought a home and they're worried in 2019 that their value is going to, fall out, we'd have to see a pretty significant correction on price. And there's just the underlying fundamentals suggest that that's very unlikely. Overall, in the Washington area, the median price would have to fall 26% from the peak levels. And you can see in the jurisdictions across the metro area, prices would have to fall 32% in Frederick, they'd have to fall 31% in Loudoun, they would have to fall 25% in Fairfax County in order for them to be back at the level they were 3 years ago. So it is very unlikely that we're going to erase the price gains of the last 2 years because inventory, as I mentioned, will stay low. Demand is still out there. I think there's just a lot of people, like I said, doing the wait and see right now. The population of first-time home buyers who have been sitting on the sidelines is only getting bigger as millennials are now between the ages of 26 and 41 and are moving right through that first-time home buyer age. As the economy continues to be stable, we're going to keep an eye on that. A recession, of course, would make it more challenging, the housing market more challenging for buyers. But if we find that the Fed is able to bring the economy in for that soft landing with their rate increases, we might find the housing market's able to rebound in the year ahead. We do need, though, we do need to expect, though, that home prices will be lower than they were earlier this year. Prices always peak in the summer, so it's not surprising that they would come down from those peaks. And when you hear about people forecasting price declines, they are usually talking about from that peak. And keep in mind, they would have to fall 26% in order for us to get back to where we were prior to the pandemic. So, we sort of like how much is the risk in the Washington area for a big drop in prices or a big slowdown in the market? And so I took a look at Washington to see how it compared to the other 50 largest metro areas in the country. And there's some things that might help us think through where our housing market might be headed. The first is, look, how fast has inventory grown over the last year? If inventory is increasing really quickly, then that would suggest that prices could come down more quickly, right? When supply floods the market, buyers have more choices and sellers don't have as much leverage on price. And so you can see from this first table that, Phoenix is the metro area where inventory has been increasing the fastest over the last year. More and more supply is coming onto the market. Surprisingly, Raleigh and Nashville and Austin, I was kind of surprised that those are the and then along with Austin and Tampa, those are the places that round out the top 5 in terms of where inventory is really coming onto the market relatively quickly. Washington ranks 41 out of 50. So while we've been seeing some modest upticks in supply, we're still relatively tight inventory compared to where the rest of the country is. The other metric we look at is, what does the buyer activity look like? And so looking at the change in pending sales between last year and this year, in San Jose, that's the place where they've seen the pending sales fall off by the most. But look, Virginia Beach, I was really surprised at this, but this is sort of like testament to the fact that those some of those smaller community, somewhat smaller communities, but places where there was a second home surge during the pandemic, they're also seeing a really big pullback in buyer activity. Riverside, California, Portland, San Diego, California. DC ranks 18th, so we're sort of like a top third. I'm doing my math, almost just outside the top third of in terms of a slowdown in buyer activity. Affordability is also a metric that we would look at to see those places might be at most risk of seeing prices fall. Your California regions are really the least affordable places: LA, San Jose, San Diego, San Francisco, and then Miami. Washington actually ranks 32 out of 50 in terms of affordability. Or unaffordability. And you might say, Lisa, how is that possible? Prices in the Washington area are so high. Well, they are, but we also have an economy that has a relatively high paying jobs. And so that those higher incomes in our area tend to offset some of the higher prices. So they push us down the ranking. So that's all that's to say is, while there are, risks of housing market correction in any metro area, we are a little bit better positioned in the Washington area in terms of these kinds of indicators of where the market might be headed. There's a question about what is normally the seasonal peak to trough in terms of prices, and I actually don't know the answer to that offhand, but I will. I can find out. I do know in the Washington area, the median price peaked in the summer, metro-wide at $605,000 in July, and we were at $550 in October. So we can do some quick math. That's actually 10% down from the peak, and that's pretty typical. And so what we'll look at is, how does it all shake out in terms of the annual prices, and what does that look like year over year when we get through the seasonal peak, seasonal trough. If there are other questions, please do put them in the chat. That's just the idea, just to gather with you all and provide a little bit of a quick update. We are, as you know, putting out a lot of data and information. Thank you for that suggestion on the listings, sort of expired, canceled, and withdrawn listings. Those did not sells. We're going to add those to those weekly reports, which come out on Tuesdays at 8 a.m. We also have our monthly report, which is out now, comes out usually the 10th or the 11th of the month. And then stay tuned. We talked a little bit about where the market's headed, and I'm just putting some finishing touches on cleaning the crystal ball a little bit, see if it can get a little bit less cloudy, in order to put out some formal forecast for where the Mid-Atlantic housing market is headed, and how the Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia markets are looking compared to the rest of the country. We tend to be in the Mid-Atlantic here a little bit of a plain vanilla kind of housing market, and in this case, that's good. So a lot of what we'll see about dramatic turnarounds in housing market will be in some of those places like Phoenix, like the California markets, like Florida markets that I saw a really big uptick in prices over the last few years. There's a comment about finding the Ouija board, and yeah, if there are people you can have me contact in the great beyond, please do let me know. I think the thing that we should all be very humble as we do our forecasts. And my goal really is not to come out and say I know exactly what's going to happen, but hopefully to present some information that can help us all think about the things we should be paying attention to help us be a resource and to help you be a resource to your clients, to your community, to your colleagues. That's really our goal here in the research shop at Bright MLS. So please do reach out to me if you have other questions. Our market research analyst is Connor Christie. You can send either one of us an email. If you do have trouble finding this webinar or these slides on the website, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. We'll make sure that we provide that information to you as a follow-on for registering for this webinar, so that you can use this material to help communicate about where the market is and where it might be headed. So if there's no other questions, I am going to